I had been on the New York Times for 10 years prior to that. I left the New York Times not out of any grief or malcontentism. I couldn't get enough time with the New York Times to work because it was a daily newspaper. And you usually had 1,200 words, 1,400 words, and it was very, if I did it for 10 years. But in my free time, I did a lot of work for Esquire. And in 1965, I was 32 years old. And I had a 1-year-old daughter. And I wanted to be more on my own, less as a daily journalist. Esquire magazine in those days was a very good magazine. Norman Mailer worked for it, Joan Didion worked for it, Gore Vidal. It was a really terrific magazine. Tom Wolfe had an editor, a very strong-willed editor named Harold Hayes, whose father was a Baptist minister from North Carolina. He was a Marine colonel or a lieutenant in the Korean War. Hayes was a tough guy. So he gave me a contract for 1 year, and he said, what would you like to do? I said, well, I really want to write about some of my New York Times people. I think they're interesting. He said, well, I'll give you can, well, what? Yeah, I'd write an obituary writer, and I'd like to write about the managing editor. He's married to Harry Truman, his daughter. His name was Clifton Daniel. Yeah, that's fine, but I want you to do Sinatra. I said, Sinatra, Dick can't do Frank Sinatra. His 50th birthday is right upon us. Every magazine in the world is doing him. He's been done. I said, all my life, I've been reading about Sinatra since I was a boy in Ocean City, New Jersey. I grew up during the World War II period. I used to listen to Frank Sinatra Lucky Strike Parade on the radio.
Your Hit Parade, starring Frank Sinatra.
He's been overdone. What can you say about Frank Sinatra that has been said numerous times in numerous ways? And the Esquire said, look, this is a cover story. The stuff you're doing with these New York Times, this is not a cover, but this is a chance for you to really be a big article. We're going to give you a lot of room, a lot of time. And you know something, it's also easy because Frank Sinatra has already gave an okay to this. His press agent, James Mahoney's already said, come on out. So he's easier. It'll take you 2 weeks, and then you come back and do the one. Then you could do the New York Times guy you want to do. Fair is okay.
I wanted to ask you, when you got the assignment, did you have any preconceived notions about Frank Sinatra?
I had only the greatest admiration for Frank Sinatra, but I did not like to write about celebrities. I had experiences writing about celebrities before this, not big as Sinatra, but one time I was sent out to do Natalie Wood for Esquire in 1962. She did Gypsy, and she was a big star with Warren Beatty and some movie I can't remember what.
Splendor in the Grass.
Yes, she was big. And I went out there in Esquire. I was still on the New York Times then, so I didn't have a lot of time to fool around. I had to see her for a weekend off. She wouldn't see me, and I killed time. She was dating Warren Beatty in those days. I liked him, but I didn't like her a lot. So I thought, these celebrity pieces are no fun. Celebrities, as a rule, have no respect for writers. They're very busy. They're celebrities. They don't have the time to talk to you anyway, and what they give you is not very much. So I was turned off celebrities. Sinatra is a super celebrity, unlike any others in the universe. I was intimidated by it. So Esquire said to do Sinatra's easy. I thought, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I took the assignment. I was in awe, but also worried about writing about Frank Sinatra. I was worried about him. I didn't think I would be able to get to him because so much pressure on him with so much publicity attached to his forthcoming 50th birthday.
Ah, yes, 50. September.
Had you met or seen him perform prior to the assignment?
I saw him one time. I one time wrote a story on Jilly Rizzo. That was in the New York Times in 1965.
Right.
And I think Jilly got a ticket for me to go out to Forest Hills. I think it was Forest Hills.
It was, with Count Basie?
Yeah, and I was there, and I saw that. It's the only time I ever saw something.
Newport Jazz Festival.
It was wonderful. And then I went back to Jilly's afterwards, and I wrote a piece about Jilly in the New York Times, which he liked, and Jilly and his cat and his wife and all that. And Sinatra was there. And his daughter, I think his one daughter was there. It might have been Tina or Nancy, maybe both. I don't remember.
Was Frank Gifford there that night?
Yes, that's the night I wrote about and couldn't get in. The bar was packed. Gifford is weaving his way through the line there.
What was the difference of the presence of Sinatra at Jilly's as when he wasn't there?
Jilly's without Sinatra was a bar. Jilly's with Sinatra was a celestial occasion where all the stars were out. Everybody was looking around at Frank, and Frank was surrounded by people who were looking at him, touching him, adoring him, feeling just exalted at the presence of this guy.
What did Sinatra mean to the Italian community back then?
Oh, Charles, this is a show in itself. We can't do that, but we're going to try a little bit to tell about it.
Please.
You must understand that I was born in 1932. I'm 90 as I speak to you now. In 1942, I was 10 and 11, and my father was from Italy, as I said before, from Calabria, not far from Sicily, where Sinatra's father's from. His mother's from Genoa, as you know. In 1942, my father had two brothers in Mussolini's army. I was born in Ocean City, which is a very waspy town. Very few Italians. Like, the Italians built the railroads going Philadelphia to Atlantic City. Italians are the bottom of the social pecking order were the Italians in those days. I felt it very much because my father's had two brothers fighting in the army for Mussolini against America. In those days, the American army was moving up through Sicily from North Africa and crossing through Sicily into Calabria, which is the tip of the boot, and about to conquer Italy at a time when my father, who came to America in 1928, or 22, became a citizen in 28. He's a tailor, I think I mentioned before, and a secure tailor in this little town. But I had these alien uncles, fascist soldiers, and my father had a picture of these two soldiers in their uniforms, these foreign-looking uniforms, in the 1940s. I would be listening to Sinatra on the radio, and on the radio was on top of a desk, and across from the radio were the pictures of the two Italian soldiers. They're my uncles, my Uncle Domenico and my Uncle Nicola. So I was hearing Sinatra, the patriotic Frank Sinatra, the adored Frank Sinatra, who's crashing from minority stardom into mainstream stardom. The remarkable thing about Frank Sinatra, he was adored by people who were so far from Italians, who didn't even think about Italians. Sinatra crashed. He became the first Italian-American who became assimilated as an American. The only Italian-American who became assimilated as an American was Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was the only mainstream figure who came out of the immigrant class like me. He was a little older. But I was mixed up because I didn't know sometimes whose side I was on the war. I felt as an Italian, I was in a parochial school. I was called Guinea Wop all the time by the Irish. The Irish kids are very poor, but they're very stupid too and very racist. They didn't like Italians at all, which is why I could never vote for John Kennedy. I carried such a scar from my boyhood. Sinatra singing, but I'm not feeling the songs getting to me very much because I'm feeling the pain of being a misplaced American. I wasn't even sure I was American. I was Italian by my father's birth. My mother's Italian because her parents came from Italy. It took me a while to accept the fact that I was American, and the guy that made that happen wasn't my father, wasn't my mother. It was Frank Sinatra.
You wrote a wonderful piece about DiMaggio. What difference did you see in DiMaggio and Sinatra?
Oh, so black and white. Sinatra was a public, outgoing personality. He embraced crowds. He wanted to be embraced by crowds, too. He was a public person. He was very comfortable in public, and he reached out to the world in his work. DiMaggio was an inward-turned solo star. He didn't even associate with his teammates. He had Tommy Henrik in the outfield, Charlie Keller. DiMaggio would never have dinner with those people. DiMaggio was a self-centered. He spoke with his bat. He was a hero in a way, but a solitary, special hero in a special world of sports. He did not transcend baseball. I mean, baseball is a national pastime. But DiMaggio didn't make any attempt to help anybody but Joe DiMaggio.
You were at the taping of The Man and His Music the first day that was scrapped because he had a cold. Was there a lot of tension because he was ill?
Oh, yeah. Now, it's easy to be smart in retrospect. At the time, when I was there, Mahoney at first wasn't going to take me. And I said, I promise I won't talk to Sinatra. I wanted to observe. I like to see Sinatra break a recording. I mean, it's an interesting, it's a big special. Yeah. I also knew Dwight Hamian, and he and I were regulars at a restaurant in New York called Gino, J-I-N-O. Sinatra used to go there, but Ed Sullivan went there every day for lunch at G-I-N-O. It's a restaurant where you couldn't use credit cards. You couldn't get a reservation. Gino had to know you, and if he knew you, you could get a credit system. You could pay monthly. But you go in there and Gino winks at you and you get a table. Sinatra was sometimes there. I know Tony Bennett, but there were a lot of times. And I was in the neighborhood and I was in good graces with Mr. Gino.
And you knew Dwight.
And I know Dwight Hamian, who was a pretty famous director. I didn't go to him for help. I didn't try to I didn't want to try to get to Sinatra around. I wanted to play by whatever the rules were, but I didn't know what the rules were. I was allowed to go to that first rehearsal. During that time, I saw Sinatra be gracious at the beginning, but later on, perhaps because he wasn't at his best with his throat, and because his voice was his life. I don't care how many movies he made 40, 50 movies, but he cared about singing. He was the solo performer. Not only was he a great singer, but he was a great verbalist. His words you could hear. I could never hear the words from anybody except Sinatra. I later heard from my friend Pete Hamill, once said that if foreigners people learn English and listen to Sinatra sing songs, that's how they learn the language. Because he used the language in such a special, unique, incomparable way. You could hear him. He didn't lose the rhythm, but the precise word, how to pronounce the words. The way he broke the words. He broke a verb into two sections, but you love turning the verb around. Master of this use of language.
So his mood was foul because he had a cold, right?
Yes, he was injured. He was like a truck hit him.
And all these people around him, they must have been deflated too, right? Because you're talking about thousands of people and a studio that's...
And the cost, I mean, right. I don't know what the cost was, but you had Nelson Riddle's 43-piece orchestra. You had all this security, you had all these hangers-on.
And the Budweiser people, because
and the Budweiser people and their girlfriends and their wives and their children. Everybody. I believe, Charles, is a lapse of maybe a week. You know better than I, because I don't have my notes in front of me. I believe that NBC rescheduled this. And I think it came back, and it might have been a week later. I mean, the second attempt, I think, might have been a week later, maybe 9 days. I don't know what it was. I was not allowed to go. Mahoney said that he spoke to Frank. And Frank said, no dice. What's that mean? I'm sorry. It means he can't go. I mean, I can't go back and listen. I won't talk to him. Sorry. Frank said, no dice. Okay. I go back to my hotel, and I called Harold Hayes. And I said, look, Sinatra said no dice. That's what Mahoney said Sinatra said. Who the hell? I don't know. But I don't have to listen to Mahoney. And I could just go. Show up. Oh, what could they do to me?
You had nothing to lose.
I had nothing to lose. So I decided on my own. I had a car. I had an Avis rent-a-car. And I knew L.A. I knew how to get there. I knew how to get to Burbank. I didn't need Mahoney to drive me there. I drive myself. I thought there'd be security, and it was raining. I remember when I arrived at Burbank, it was raining. I didn't have an umbrella. People were running all over the place. And I walk into the studio. There's about a lot of hangars. This Burbank had a lot of looked like airplane hangars. They were studios. So many dozens of studios. It's just one of people were crowding in. I just joined the mob. Go ahead. They had umbrellas. I'm running, kicking out of the rain. Walk right in. Nobody stops me. I walk in. I saw Sinatra near his dressing room. So what I did is I just walked up, and I stood behind, I think it was Brad Dexter, big guy. I was behind Brad Dexter. I overheard Sinatra talking about Patterson fight. But Patterson had a chance. Well, I knew Patterson. I wrote 40 articles on Patterson. I was a good friend of Frank Patterson, going back to my early days as a sports writer of the New York Times. I knew that Sinatra, whatever he believed. But Sinatra was saying, you could do it. And then Riddle said they're ready. So Sinatra's going back on the stage. And I'm behind Dexter, and I don't know if Sinatra knew who I was. Maybe he did. And I reached and Sinatra shook my hand. And I said, Mr. Sinatra, I love the show, the CBS show you did last. I love the show. He said, well, what Jack Gould at the time said. He said they should have done more than that. I said, yes, and I'm here, Mr. Sinatra. I never call him Frank. Mr. Sinatra, I'm here. He said, well, I'm sorry, I've been so busy. And then I heard him say, but maybe we can work something out. I think I heard him say that. It was his soft voice, and people were around him. And I didn't say anything, but maybe it's a chance. He went with his group, and Mahoney went with him, and Mahoney didn't say, get out of here. Nobody said I had to leave. Sinatra, after the show was over, was ecstatic. He loved that show. And later on, he told Dwight Hemming it's probably one of the happy times of his life.
You also attended a Sinatra recording session. He was making an album in November '65 called Moonlight Sinatra. What was that like?
That was at night. There was the full orchestra. And also a lot of people, the Drysdale, the baseball star was there.
Sure.
The golfer, Bo Whittaker, Jeroge, a lot of people. It was packed. And Sinatra was on top of the world. And he sang beautifully that night.
How would you describe this dance where he clearly acknowledged you and allowed you to linger and lurk, but still refused to give you an on-the-record interview?
I think that the experience I had with Sinatra was twofold. One experience I had, which was negative, was because his world was negative at the time. The voice, the concern about the Cronkite interview that would link him with organized crime figures, which he so loathed because as a young man, he too had to battle organized crime and the film The Godfather with the horse cut off, all that stuff was an affront to Sinatra's dignity, an assault on questioning his talent, that he needed the help of the mob. And he was assaulted by that. But he had this Cronkite. It didn't happen, but Charles, I arrived at the wrong time. I arrived at the wrong time when I flew out to see him. Later on, by just hanging out and being persevering in a way, and always polite and not aggressive, his world changed. His voice came back. When his voice came back, his personality came back. His affection and his big heart came back. He was nicer to people after the voice came back than he was before. I was the recipient, because I was there long enough, to see the other side, the sunny side of Sinatra.
You had previously written an article, as we mentioned, about Jilly's. Do you think that your friendship with Jilly from this article, I know you got to Frank's parents.
That's because of Jilly.
That was because of Jilly, yeah.
Not only is Frank's parents, Frank's son.
What was it like visiting Dolly and Marty, Frank's parents, at their home in Fort Lee, New Jersey?
Oh, it was memorable. First of all, Sinatra's mother is an astonishing character, strong, tough. She was a woman who didn't take no for an answer. She took that little prize-fighter husband of hers and made him a captain of the fire department. She played politics like few people could, but she, I believe, was the guiding force in Frank Sinatra's life. Sure, he had his wife, and he had a second wife, and he had a third wife, and he had a fourth wife. Sure. Dolly was the dominant force in Sinatra's heart. When he couldn't necessarily hang on with these Hoboken guys, she got him a car, she bought him a car, an old Chrysler or whatever it was. Got him, he couldn't sing at the Rustic Cabin, she got to the Union guy. Dolly knew how to get things done. She talked to the Union guy, let's get Frankie, okay, make him a singer waiter at the Rustic Cabin. It's not taking anything away from Frank and his talent. But if he wasn't the Rustic Cabin, he wouldn't have been on the radio. If he wasn't on the radio, Harry James, his girlfriend or his wife, wouldn't have heard him. A lot had happened at Rustic Cabin because he was able to get on the radio. And that radio was in New York City, wasn't in New Jersey. She's an amazing woman.
Yeah, what was the dynamic between her and Marty like?
She's a very quiet man.
Didn't Frank call while you were there?
Yeah, he called.
You attended the Patterson-Ali Cassius Clay fight in Las Vegas, so you were around Sinatra in Las Vegas. What was that like?
Weird. What was weird about it is that Jack Entrada, who's a close friend of Frank Sinatra, Jack Entrada was like, he talked to me about being a friend of Frank Sinatra. Jack Entrada was then dating a woman he later married who was a showgirl, undercover. And Jack Entrada told me that, and not the only guy, to be a friend of Frank Sinatra has made you feel young. Sinatra was about to be 50. I think Jack Entrada was 51, 52. And Jack said, I wish I could live like Frank. I wish I knew how to live. He said, people like me, and there are dozens of people who are friends like me with Sinatra. Sinatra lets us know how to live. We don't know how to live. We're successful. I remember Jack and Trotty saying, you know, I could own a helicopter. I could own my own plane. I have enough money. I have houses here and there. I don't need the mercenary side of being Sinatra to make me feel fulfilled. But what I don't have to do, or what I don't know, is I don't know how to live. Sinatra's 50, but he makes me feel like I'm 26. And Sinatra had that. Sinatra didn't let his marriages stop him from living, didn't let his girlfriend stop him from living, Sinatra was eternally young. And Sinatra had such effect on men in that conservative post-World War period when Sinatra first rose to stardom. And Jack and Trotter was a nice guy. And when I went to the fight, Mahoney, I had a ticket to the fight because I went to every Patterson fight. I didn't need Mahoney to give me a ticket. But I could see Sinatra with his group. But after the fight was over and Patterson was destroyed, Ali just carried Patterson. It went on 11 rounds, but it was never a fight. And after that, Sinatra went back to the Sands with
Dean and Joey. Didn't they do a show?
They had a show to do.
Did you see that show?
Yeah, I saw the show. When the fight was over and Patterson is humiliated, but he had a press conference. I went to the press conference. I didn't go to the Sands right away.
And then didn't you follow them to the Sahara to see Don Rickles?
Yeah, I did.
And what was that like?
It's great because what I loved about it, Don Rickles was so wonderful, and Frank was the top of the world. He was in a good mood. The insults were not taken seriously. But what I liked about it is after they finished, and I was then living on Sinatra time. I stayed up to 5 that night. I'm living Sinatra's hours, which is new for me. After the Sands, after the Sahara, they went back to the Sands, but they had breakfast, for Christ's sake. And Sinatra had a table reserved behind a white trellis. I watched him, but later on, when Sinatra left the table and played blackjack by himself, I got close. I overheard him talking to the blackjack guy, and I used that quote, but I described him as tuxedo. He was so beautifully. I did interview his tailor, Carol and Company. I remember Callan told me that Frank had always had 2 tuxedos in the process of being made. 2 tuxedos. He had like a dozen tuxedos, because he always had a tuxedo every night. But he wore through tuxedos. The Carol tailors were always making 2 tuxedos for Frank Sinatra. I didn't use that, but that's Carol. So Sinatra, when I saw him in Las Vegas, he looked magnificent.
Gay, I'm going to name some people, and you let me know any recollections you may have about encountering them during the time you were doing the article. The first person I want to ask you is about Hank Santacola, because at this point, he was not part of the inner circle. He had been with Frank for years. They had a falling out. But he did speak to you about Ava, the relationship between Ava and Frank. Why do you think he agreed to speak with you?
Well, he was on the outs with Frank. That's one thing. See, when I was not able to get to Frank, and Mahoney said I was finished, I thought, well, I have to talk to people who knew Frank. And I'd love to talk. When I was a New York Times reporter, one of the famous reporters at that time was named James Reston. People now don't know who James is. But when I was around 34 years ago, he was a Washington bureau chief, and they had a column. And James Reston talked to reporters and advised them, talk to the unhappy ones. Reston said, talk to the unhappy ones.
Did you ever see or talk to Mia Farrow during that time? Did you see her around? You don't mention her much in the article. Was she not around?
I knew her before, because before I knew her, because she was with Ryan O'Neal. I knew Ryan O'Neal. And one time I met her. Later on, my wife published her. My wife is Dan Talese, is a book publisher. But I never saw her in California. No, I didn't see her.
You didn't see. Okay. George Jacobs.
At first he wouldn't talk to me, but then he did talk to me. And he was very good. Because he would tell me, one time he told me that sometimes Frank was alone, he didn't want to be alone, was lonely, and he had George Jacobs. Or some days he'd say, George, cook me something simple, I don't want... And one time George Jacobs told me he overheard Frank Sinatra on the phone trying to get a date on a Saturday night. Frank Sinatra trying to get a date on Saturday. It's like being a Hoboken at the age of 17. It's a singing with the rustic cabin. Can't get it. That's crazy. But it just shows you that the mythology of Frank Sinatra was did not always match with the reality of Sinatra. Not that it was a demeaning thing, but Jacobs was pretty honest. Jacobs was ambitious, I think, and he drove Rolls Royces for Swifty the Czar.
Leo DeRocher, had you known Leo prior to this?
He wouldn't talk to me ever. One time he broke dates. I got nowhere with him. Someone gave me his phone number. He never would see me. He said he would, but he never would.
Brad Dexter, he spoke to you.
Brad Dexter invited me to the Warner Brothers studio, to Frank's office. Brad Dexter sits in Frank's chair. Frank's desk was shaped like a wing of an airplane. And the chair itself, I remember it was orange, it was cushion. And Dexter is talking to me and asked me, hey, look, if this thing doesn't work out, maybe talk to me. Maybe I'll do a piece for Esquire. I was not the first guy who told me that.
Tell me about Jane Hogue.
Across the street from the Beverly Wilshire Hotel was Life magazine, had an office. And Life magazine had a woman correspondent named Jane Alexander. She had a secretary named Jane Hogue. But Miss Alexander, I knew her, and I went up to see her. I guess I was looking for people who knew Sinatra. My secretary went to school with Nancy. So I talked to Jane Hogue, and she told me the story about the alabaster bird. Beautiful story. She went to a birthday, I think it was a birthday party, and Frank, as we all know, he was divorcing from his wife after 10 years, but he always was a dear person to his first wife. He treated her with great respect, and they had a wonderful relationship. Considering their divorce, he left her for Ava Gardner, and apparently 2 alabaster birds on a mantle, and she actually knocked one of these birds with an elbow on the floor, and it cracked in a dozen pieces. And Nancy was there, and oh, my mother's favorite, or something like that. Oh, that's my mother's favorite. Frank Sinatra walks over and knocks the other out, just automatic. Didn't even think about it. Just that instinctive. Okay, don't worry about it, pal. Such a gesture, such thinking. Only Frank Sinatra would have done that. The rashness of the gesture. It just happened.
Because he didn't want her to feel bad.
Yes, but what a way not to say, "Oh, don't you worry about it. I'll buy another one," because he could have bought 5,000 alabaster birds if he wanted to. That wasn't something that couldn't be replaced. It wasn't a work of art by Michelangelo, for God's sake. But he knocked it over. The impulsive thing, the right thing to do, but the impulsive way to do it. Sinatra, period Sinatra.
You wrote a letter to him on December 4th, 1965, saying that you were a distant observer, you came as a friend, and you leave as one. You never got a response.
No.
Do you think Frank ever read the piece?
No. I don't know. One thing about that piece, I regret something about that piece very much. At first, when Esquire's Harold Hayes was negotiating the assignment, Harold Hayes was going to get a great photographer to take a picture of Frank. They were going to set up the picture maybe first before I went out there. And we couldn't, when Sinatra turned on the story because of the cold and everything else that we've been talking about for almost an hour, when this piece was written, Harold Hayes hired an illustrator. Ed Sorrell did a nasty portrait of Sinatra. It was a man that almost like a rodent, and there were under his chin extended cigarette lighters, a bunch of flunkies trying to light the cigarette. Moreover, inside the article, not on the cover alone, but inside the article, on the columns of the article was 14,000 words. It was many pages. All the sides of the illustrated with pictures of unflattering pictures of Sinatra. They weren't photographs. The article that appeared on the cover of Esquire was so unattractive. Sprague's picture was so unattractive. Maybe he wouldn't even want it. Maybe he threw it in the trash and looked at it. I don't know. I have no clue whether they read the piece, even looked at the piece. One thing is true, as I said in the letter, I came as a friend, I left as a friend. I was always a friend. In my mind, I did the best I could. I thought it was a very favorable piece. But with that goddamn Ed Sorrell cover, I got a bad representation of the tone of the article. And the cover, I'm afraid, created the tone that was negative. I think it was vengeful. I think Harold Hayes was vengeful towards Mahoney, Sinatra, Rudin, and everybody else. And he was going to put Sinatra down because he said we're doing a favorable piece. And I wrote a piece. They didn't change the piece. No one changed a word or made it hard. Nobody injected anything. I thought the piece was favorable. It stands up. People read it now that it's a favorable piece, it's a memorable piece, because it was written by a person who had a heart, about a person who had a heart, a writer who had a heart, and a great performer, Sinatra, who had a great heart. It was a person, I had a feeling for the man. There's a feeling for the man. Yes, there are scenes when the man behaved, he's pissed off, and then yes, but that was part of the man. Sinatra was a volatile character at times. He's the most generous, loving person at times. Both of them are part of Sinatra. Sinatra's a man of many pieces, many fibered, many flavored character, many dimensions.
After the article was published, did you ever have any contact with Sinatra or see him out socially?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, what happened was, I mentioned I have a wife named Nan Talese, who was a book publisher for many years, for Random House for a long time. And one time she discovered a poet who was selling books out of his trunk of his car, self-publishing. His name was Rod McEwen. And she liked these poems. I mean, he wasn't as her pal, but he's a poet. He used to sing his songs too. And so she sold these books, and she published one for Random House, and the books became a bestseller. She published another one, a bestseller. Not only is he a best-selling, but he sings, and he got to sing at Carnegie Hall. He was singing.
Yes, and Frank did an album of all
and
his.
Frank's is an album.
A Man Alone.
Yeah, man. And Bennett Cerf, the head of Random House, Dan's boss,
was good friends with Frank, right?
Yeah, but I didn't know that. The only reason is Rod McEwen is going to be a guest on the weekend at the Mount Kisco home, a country home of Bennett Cerf and his wife Phyllis. Phyllis also loved Frank Sinatra. And Nan was invited because she was editor of Rod McEwen. And because I'm a husband, I got a free ride to go out there at Bennett Cerf's house. There were other people there. I don't know who was there. One of them, to my shocking surprise, is Frank Sinatra. But he was not in a happy mood. He was by himself. And you know what I noticed about him? He had a radio. There was a radio. It was outside. It was a buffet luncheon. A lot of people were there. Because Bennett Cerf knew a lot of people. There might have been writers there besides. Frank had the radio on, and I believe it was a baseball game. Listen to the baseball game.
Never spoke to you, and you didn't approach him.
Oh, no, I didn't suppose so.
So the last time you actually saw him was at Bennett Cerf's house?
Yeah, and before that, my last time I saw him was, they saw him at Queen.
When you left L.A.,
Yeah,
yeah.
I said goodbye to him. And I never spoke to him. I saw him. Last time I spoke to him was when I said goodbye to him and I saw him at Queen. I never spoke to him in Las Vegas. I never spoke to him at Bennett Cerf.
The best story Esquire ever published, that's how Esquire describes Frank Sinatra as a cold. That must make you very proud, does it?
It happened in 2003. That article is in many languages. It's all over the world. And that article is in a lot of college textbooks. So a lot of college kids who read about nonfiction writing or the profile writing would read that. And it was gratifying. Why did that story live? That story lived because the guy that it was about won't die, because those songs won't die. Sinatra, when he became famous in 1944 or 54, after he made From Tear to Eternity at his comeback, or 64 or 65 and is about to turn 50, and then he was in the 60s and 70s, and he was performing and enchanting his audience, whether it's Radio City or before 10,000 people in Las Vegas, at a big concert. He was a man who was not going to die. All the famous contemporaries he had, Perry Como, Eddie Fisher, Billy Eckstine, Billie Holiday. I mean, I don't want to run a whole list of people and put them down to compare them with Sinatra, because you can't compare with Sinatra. All those people, there are a lot of famous singers in 1965 when I wrote about Sinatra. Very famous. Rock singers, the folk singers. And now only Sinatra's alive. He's been dead for a long time. Why? Because he's a linguist, too. You understand the words. The songs, you understand the words. It's like a novel. People, Hemingway's alive. Why? Because he wrote beautifully. F. Scott Fitzgerald, Tolstoy, Shakespeare. People live because they what they do is timeless and ageless and eternal. Sinatra is eternal. Well, let me just say, because I'm not the most modest guy on your show here, I was the right guy for that article. There are a lot of, Sinatra's been written about by books, many books, thousands of articles, some of them by famous writers. I'm the only one. Why? Because I grew up because of Sinatra. I'd say I grew up with Sinatra. I didn't. I grew up because of Sinatra. I was born in 1932. I'm quite young, a bit younger. But I became Gay Talese, who was able to write in the English language, though his father spoke with an accent, my father from Italy. My work as a writer is directly connected to Sinatra. My confidence as a writer is directly connected to Sinatra. If I didn't have Sinatra in my life, I would have been a very shy Italian-American boy who would have felt I had to hang out with Italian kids. I was born in a town where they weren't Italian kids. I was born in a waspy town, the son of my uncles were fascist soldiers of the infantry of Mussolini. And my father was a kind of accommodating guy who was Italian and never denied it. But he wasn't going to help me. My father was torn about his parents and people in Italy, and Italians were at the lowest level of the pecking order. The only guy that didn't know that is Sinatra. Sinatra didn't have Italian being, he didn't think of himself as inferior. He wasn't inferior to Franklin Roosevelt in his head. And that confidence of that cocky guy from Hoboken caught me, not first through Lucky Strike Radio. I used to listen to him on Saturday or whatever it was. And listened on the radio that had the radio on both sides with those pictures of uncles, those fascist soldier uncles. So the complexity of my life, the songs of Sinatra and the uncles from in the POW camp at the time. My own sense of security was more forthright and formidable because Sinatra became an American that America loved, because I got a free pass. I slipped in that doorway that Sinatra opened to my own career, not as a singer or performer or celebrity, writer, actor. I could have been an actor maybe because so many Italians are actors. I mean, half of the Italians are actors. No. I'm a man who's uniquely centered as an Italian-American, as a writer. There are very few writers, very few Italian-Americans who make a living in the English language. I became American Italian. I made a living, a big living, writing in English. My father couldn't even pronounce very much, but Sinatra couldn't pronounce English. I followed the linguistic line of Sinatra. I became a writer thanks to Sinatra. That's a story.